So far we have seen how to create a functional component. Now in this section, we will see another way to create a component, a class component. In versions before React 16.8, class was the only component which could use state in it. But after React 16.8, even the functional component can have states. So earlier there were terms like stateful component, which used to refer to class component, and stateless component, which used to refer to functional component. But now there is just class and functional component, as both have states. Components defined as class still provide more features than a functional component. The React.component needs to be extended to create a class component. So let's check a class component first. I'm going to open Code Sandbox, where you will see that there is a functional component by default. Assume that you want to convert this very functional component to class-based component. Let me just change the h1 here. I'm going to remove this h2 and I'll straight away change this text and make it functional to class. Now if you want to convert the functional component to class component, or rather you want to create a class component, as I mentioned, you need to have React.component to be extended. So this app will actually be a class. So instead of function, I'll say class, and because it's a class, I don't need these parentheses, and I'm going to say extends from. Now here you can say component capital C, that is straight away. You can also write React.component, but because in the beginning I have already an import of React, I can directly say component. So I'm going to say component here. Now this needs to be imported. Just observe this line number 1, and now it is automatically imported. Now the class component is created. The next thing is the way we have return statement inside the functional component, we cannot have the same thing in a class component. Class has an essential method called render. Inside the render method, you have to return the JSX. So the only thing I need to do is I just put this return statement, which was not inside any of the method, now is inside a render method. So this is the end of render, and that's it. Let me just refresh again. Though it runs automatically, the component is getting executed. So this is how a functional component can be converted into class component. Or in other words, this is how a class component looks like, where you have the component extended, and not only that, you must have the render method. In a class component, you may have other methods also, like you may have a constructor which is executed when the class is initiated, but this we will see in the next section, where we focus more on the component lifecycle methods. Render is a component lifecycle method, but it is a kind of method which is needed in all the components. Now next thing we need to discuss, how can we take state in a class-based component? We have already seen that in a functional component, we use the use state, which returns the state itself, and we take it in a different variable like this. So this is how you take state in a functional component. But let's say I want to have the state in a class component. How can I take it? In the earlier versions, we used to have constructor, and inside constructor we used to take like this. But now React does not ask you to have the constructor always. You can directly declare a state. You can say state is equal to, for example, let's take a counter is 0. So now this is an object literal. So state is the fixed name you have to take. You can't take some other name. In functional component case, you do take your own state names, but you have the use state as the method which is fixed. Similarly, here you have the state as a fixed object literal name. So that is going to be the React's own value. Now, here we have the counter. Let's say we want to display this. So directly we used to display in a functional component by saying just counter. But here, because we are in the class, we are going to say this dot this.state.counter. And now you see that the 0 is displayed. So when it comes to taking a class and using a state, we take the object literal and we define multiple states. Let's say you want to have more states, you put a comma here. Say you want to have an array, so you just say that I want to have an empty array like this. This is also possible. So this is how you take the state in a class component. So let's move with the relative questions. The first question is, explain the stateful and stateless component. Now this question basically used to be asked a lot when hooks were not there. But even till today, if you want to show that you have experience, then you certainly do understand what used to be stateful and stateless component. So this is what I explained earlier. In versions before React 16.8, class was the only component which could use state in it. But after React 16.8, even the functional component can have states. So earlier there were terms like stateful component, which used to refer to class component, and stateless component, which used to refer to functional component. But now there is just class and functional component, as both have states. The second question is, convert this functional component into class component. So this is how a functional component can be converted into class component. Or in other words, this is how a class component looks like, where you have the component extended, and not only that, you must have the render method. The third question is, what is a render method in a class component? So render is a very essential method. In fact, it is a component lifecycle method, and that's the topic which we are going to see next. But render is needed whenever you have a class. So whatever states are updated, whenever states are updated, render method is called, and render is containing the JSX, which is actually the user interface. The fourth question is, how do you declare state in a class component? So this is how we did it. So when it comes to taking a class and using a state, we take the object literal and we define multiple states.